And joining us now is Patrick Monahan. He is the Dean of the Osgoode Hall Law School, and we welcome you back to TVO, Patrick.
My pleasure, Steve.
Good to see you again. Okay, let's do a little election calling 101 here for those who don't know. There's the Prime Minister, there's the Governor General. What does the law say about who calls the election?
Well, it's actually the Governor General, and of course she's an appointed person. She's appointed on the advice of the Prime Minister, but because she's appointed, she exercises her powers on the advice or on the instructions of the Prime Minister. So technically what's going to happen, and we think it's going to happen this weekend, the Prime Minister will go to Rideau Hall, the Governor General's residence, call on her and say, Madame Jean, I'm advising you to dissolve Parliament, fix the date for a general election, and she will automatically have to abide by his instructions.
Does it matter if it's a majority or a minority government when the Prime Minister makes that advice to her?
Well, the key question in our system is, does the Prime Minister enjoy the support of the majority in the House of Commons? That's so-called the confidence of the House of Commons. Well, Mr. Harper, I think, still does enjoy the confidence of the House of Commons. He's survived numerous confidence votes over the last 6 months or so, and he hasn't been defeated, even though Mr. Dion has talked about possibly defeating him. So in those circumstances, I think the circumstances are clear that the Governor General really needs to follow the advice of Mr. Harper.
We're going to get into this more in a second, but of course what makes this more interesting is that Mr. Harper passed a law requiring fixed election dates. No longer was he going to do what prime ministers have done for 140 years, which is essentially advise the Governor General to call an election when he wants. Essentially what he said was, there it is on the calendar. We can all look forward to it. We all know when it's going to happen at the same time.
And that was a good idea, Steve.
I
think
so?
it's a progress to have fixed elections, I think.
Is he following his own law in this case?
Well, in fact, there was an escape clause in the law. And the escape clause said there will be an election on October the 19th, 2009, unless the Governor General dissolves Parliament at some other time. And that was inserted because under our Constitution, you can't restrict the powers of the Governor General without a constitutional amendment. Or at least that's what the Minister of Justice said at the time. And in fact, a number of experts, including myself, went up to Ottawa when we were asked about that. And we said, well, that's just there to deal with the possibility that the government might be defeated on a vote of confidence before October the 19th, 2009. So in those circumstances, you would have to have an election in a minority parliament. So we thought that's really what that's there for. But now what Mr. Harper is doing is using that kind of escape clause, which I think was inserted for one purpose, to deal with the possibility of a defeat, and now to deal with, to basically say, well, I'd like to have an election now, and so I'm really going to breach the spirit of that legislation.
So as you folks would say, the law is an ass here.
Well, the law is really imposing, ultimately, Steve, a political obligation. It's really saying there will be an election unless the Prime Minister decides to call one sooner. Or if the government were defeated, that would also trigger an election.
But if the idea of fixed election dates is to constrain the power of the Prime Minister, this doesn't really appear to be doing that at all, does it?
It doesn't. It's really not working very well here, and I think it's a step back, in fact, and I'm hoping that this precedent won't be taken in future years. Certainly if there was a majority government, I think there would be no excuse whatsoever for Mr. Harper to be calling an early election. The only really cover he has is that we're in a minority parliament, and I think the opposition parties have been talking about defeating Mr. Harper in the fall. So the opposition parties, in a sense, were saying, well, we don't really want to wait until October 2009 either.
All of this notwithstanding, you think he's well within his rights, obviously, to go to the Governor General and ask her to dissolve Parliament and send us all to the polls.
It's within his legal rights.
Legal rights. Not everybody agrees with you, and I have watched with amusement how you and Errol Mendez from the University of Western Ontario have got into this a little bit on the op-ed pages of the newspapers, and I want to read an excerpt from something he wrote recently for the Edmonton Journal. He writes, even if the fixed election law does not constrain the Governor General's discretion to grant dissolution of Parliament, one could argue that the law constrains the Prime Minister's power to ask for one until October 2009. Hiding under the political constraints of the Governor General's residual power is nevertheless a violation of a statute. Some aggrieved citizen may even consider seeking court action to stop this legally dubious move. And speaking of moves, Errol did not move to the UWO. He's at the University of Ottawa, of course.
Right, right.
What do you think of the argument he's advancing?
Well, I mean, Errol, first of all, is a friend, and he really is an outstanding constitutional authority.
But you don't agree with him?
I don't agree with him on this particular point. I think that the law doesn't, in fact, say anything about the Prime Minister advising the Governor General. It doesn't restrain the Prime Minister from advising the Governor General legally. And what Errol was suggesting is that there could be a legal case. It doesn't constrain the Governor General. It says the Governor General retains her power, and it says nothing about the Prime Minister. So I don't think there's really a legal case. I think there is a political argument to say he's breaking a political commitment, and that's something that the voters will have to assess in the campaign.
In fact, Jeffrey Simpson wrote about that in the Globe and Mail recently as well. He writes, "What about this fall? Would Parliament paralyze the government? Almost certainly not, given past performance. But if paralyzing circumstances arose, let alone a defeat on a confidence vote, the Prime Minister could fairly ask for dissolution without testing Parliament. Any argument of anticipatory deadlock is merely theoretical, and thus, Jeffrey says, cannot qualify as extraordinary circumstances. The PM's argument, in other words, is bogus." So talk to me about the politics of it. Does the, if the Prime Minister were going to abide by the spirit of his law, should he at least bring Parliament back first, suffer a defeat, and then go to the polls?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what Mr. Harper actually suggests when he goes to advise the Governor General. There have been some reports that he's going to suggest that he thinks he's lost the confidence of the House. I'm not clear how Mr. Harper can say he's lost the confidence of the House. There hasn't been a vote of non-confidence. The opposition hasn't been clear it's going to defeat him. And I agree with Jeffrey. Until Parliament were to meet and until we saw that Parliament wasn't working, I don't think Mr. Harper really has a case to say that Parliament couldn't work. I really think what this comes down to is Mr. Harper's looking at the polls. He's looking at the possibility of being defeated by Mr. Dion at a time that Mr. Dion might choose, and he's saying, well, I'd prefer to pull the plug because it's really to my political advantage to do it at this time.
Does it really matter one way or another? I mean, he's got the power. He can go. Does it matter what he says to the Governor General?
Well, I mean, I think that does matter what he says to the Governor General.
Why?
I mean, the Governor General is the head of state, and the Prime Minister has to treat her with proper respect, and he has to be candid and forthright with the Governor General and not try to spin a political tale.
Yeah, but whether he says, I think I've lost the confidence of the House, or I just think the time is right for me to go to the polls because I think I can win again, does that matter?
Well,
Either way, we're going.
Either way, we're going, yeah. And I think that it's just a matter of courtesy that the Prime Minister should treat the Governor General with the appropriate amount of respect.
Okay, now here's where it's been pretty interesting with this fixed election date, brings a new wrinkle into it. Here's an added wrinkle. When the Prime Minister advises the Governor General to dissolve Parliament, could she, on the grounds that we do have a fixed election date and we are not yet at that date in 2009, say, Mr. Harper, thank you for the advice, but I reject it?
Well, I actually think, Steve, that would be improper. It's true that the election, the legislation does refer to this election as being held in October, but it also says that the legislation does not constrain her powers to dissolve Parliament. So she still has the power. The Prime Minister is advising her to dissolve Parliament, and I think under our system of government, she should dissolve Parliament. And were she not to do so, I think it would provoke a significant constitutional crisis, and I'd be very surprised if Madame Jean does anything other than immediately grant the request.
Legally speaking, though, she could do it, couldn't she? She could refuse to accede to his request.
It's true, legally speaking, Steve, because under our system, these constraints on the Governor General are matters only of constitutional convention. What we call constitutional convention really are sort of accepted practices in our system. So legally, yes, the Governor General could refuse, but that would provoke a huge crisis. In fact, there was the last time the Governor General refused the request of a Prime Minister was back in 1926 when Lord Byng refused the request of Mackenzie King, and that provoked a constitutional crisis, and ultimately Mr. King was returned to power in the next election.
These two words that rhyme, King and Byng, are going to come up a lot in the next little while before this trip takes place to Rideau Hall. So just put a little more flesh on that bone. Take us back to the time Mackenzie King was the sitting Prime Minister. He asked Lord Byng to dissolve Parliament. Lord Byng refused.
Right.
Which he was entitled to do.
He was entitled to do it.
And he gave the job to somebody else.
He gave the job to Arthur Meehan. The circumstances were quite different. There'd been an election about 6 months previously, and in fact, Mackenzie King had won the second most number of seats in that election. It was Arthur Meehan who had won almost a majority of seats in that election, but Mr. King continued to govern with the support of a third party, the Progressive Party at that time. And so what happened was now the Progressives said, we're no longer going to support King, and King was facing a certain defeat in the House of Commons. So he didn't want to allow Meehan to form the government. He went to the Governor General and said, call another election. Well, Byng looked at that and said, well, look, Meehan won the most seats in the last election. He hasn't been given a chance to form a government. And I think given the fact that you're about to be defeated, King, I don't think you should have the right to force another election without giving Arthur Meehan a chance to form a government. Now, Meehan did form a government. 3 days later, he was defeated on a motion of confidence. They went to the polls anyway.
And King actually campaigned against Byng as opposed to Meehan, didn't he?
And King campaigned against Byng and said, this is the imperial connection, where we shouldn't be treated as colonialists. he won and, in fact, got a working majority in the election.
Admittedly, the analogy is not perfect. As you point out, back then it was a 6-month-old government, not an almost 3-year-old government, which we have now. But humor me a bit here. Could Michaël Jean say, you know what? It's not time for an election. We have a fixed election date. We're not there yet. Stéphane Dion has almost as many seats as you do. I'm going to give him a chance to see if he can call the House and gain the confidence of the House.
Well, I mean, a couple of things. First of all, Stéphane Dion isn't asking the Governor General to give him a chance to form a government. And I think the reason for that is quite obvious. There's really no chance whatsoever that Stéphane Dion could form a government. In order to form a government, he's got 95 seats. He needs another 60 seats. He'd have to get the support of both the Bloc Québécois and the NDP to form a government. Well, Mr. Layton is not going to support Mr. Dion, and Mr. Duceppe, rather, from the Bloc Québécois, is certainly not going to support Mr. Dion. So there's really no chance whatsoever that Dion could form a government. I think on that basis, again, it would be really improper for the Governor General to say, I'm going to exercise my discretion and ask Mr. Dion to become the Prime Minister.
So just so I've got all the bases covered here, do you think there are any circumstances nowadays, not 1926 King Byng, nowadays, for a Governor General to deny a sitting Prime Minister the right to pull the plug on the House and send us all to the polls when he or she wants to do that?
I think there are some cases. I mean, we had one here in Ontario in 1985 where David Peterson and Bob Rae signed an agreement called an accord that was basically going to say that Mr. Peterson was going to be the Premier for 2 years. And Frank Miller, the Premier at that time, was defeated in the House and advised the Lieutenant Governor to ask Mr. Peterson to form the government.
That was the key difference.
That was the key difference.
Didn't say, let's go to the polls again.
But supposing Frank Miller, instead of that, had said, because it was rumored at the time, it was suggested at the time, maybe Frank Miller said was going to advise the Lieutenant Governor to call another election. I think in those circumstances, the Lieutenant Governor at that time, John Blackheard, would have been justified in saying, look, I'm going to call on David Peterson anyway. There's this accord in place. Peterson clearly can form a government. And you, Frank Miller, at that time had been defeated on a motion of non-confidence. So I think in those cases, it would be appropriate. But, you know, it's going to be very rare, very unusual circumstances, because after all, the Governor General is an appointed official, not an elected one.
So despite my best efforts to make this story way more interesting than it really is, we're going to the polls.
I think we're going to the polls, Steve, and everybody knows we're going to the polls, and people are already gearing up for that.
No, you can't blame a girl for trying. Okay, Patrick Monahan, good to have you here at TVO tonight. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Steve.